I'll try to fill you in and bring you up to date on things going on in artificial intelligence and a new branch of artificial intelligence called expert systems. I don't know how much you've heard of all this, though it's something the media loves to talk about. It's been on Nova and the Dan Rather Show and the Evening News, and just generally, everybody is fascinated with the question of whether computers can be intelligent. And by a kind of accidents, I've been involved in this for a long time. When I taught at MIT, the students who came to my course came directly from what was called then the robot lab. Now it's called the AI lab, and told me that the kind of things that I was saying philosophers were trying to understand, like perception and understanding and action, had already been understood or were about to be understood by the people who were programming computers to do that sort of thing. And that was back in 1963 about. So I've been involved ever since. And now it's about the 30th birthday of artificial intelligence. It's not exactly clear when it started, but around 1955 is when people got together and began to realize that computers didn't have to be used just for calculation. They could be used to represent objects in the world and features of objects in the world, and then they could use logical rules to relate these objects or features and draw conclusions about things that follow from that, things that could happen or would happen, so that they could solve problems and, in general, play games, do things that were intelligent. That was about 30 years ago. And recently, the Artificial Intelligence Journal decided to have an issue, a 30th anniversary issue, looking back over the field to see what progress had been made. And they asked all the famous AI people like Marvin Minsky at MIT and Alan Newell and Herb Simon at Carnegie Mellon and John McCarthy at Stanford. And oddly enough, they asked me, too, to write for this. I still don't know what that means, whether it means that they're now so secure that they can let me say whatever I please. They know that they're having a great success and they don't care, or whether they're now so insecure and in such bad shape that they're ready to turn to philosophy, which people always do when things are going badly and they don't understand why. So I had to think back over what happened over these last 30 years, and it looked to me, it suddenly dawned on me, really, that what's happening in AI is a perfect example of what a philosopher of science named Lakatos, whom you wouldn't have heard of, but who's not all that famous even, but has a very interesting idea. He has the idea of something called a degenerating research program. And it seems to me that artificial intelligence is really an ideal example of what Lakatos would call a degenerating research program. What's characteristic of a degenerating research program is that in some domain somebody's got a good idea, they try it out, it works very well in the areas in which they try it, it looks like it can be extended and generalized to other areas, and it even begins to work in these other areas, and then it runs into trouble, problems that were unexpected, that nobody knows how to solve, and gradually people lose faith in this technique and drop out of this field and take what they can and make money with it, or do something else altogether, or try to do the same thing in some other way. All of these things are happening now, I think, in artificial intelligence. So I'll try to trace the history of AI for you, obviously from my slanted perspective, just to show you that this is not a majority feeling. In the same issue, as I was calling this a degenerating research program, Alan Newell, who's one of the founders of AI, was saying that AI was making exponential progress. So the diversity of views was quite striking. Even that is striking. I mean, that there should be so much disagreement about whether, because I'm not the only one who was saying it wasn't making progress. Roger Schank at Yale was saying that they're stuck and they don't even know what a problem is or what a PhD is. It's a very confusing field. The only people who are sure that they're making progress and that computers are about to be intelligent and will soon use us as pets are the people in the media who write articles saying this every few weeks. So it all began very auspiciously. It began when Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, as I said, thought it over in about 1955 and thought computers aren't just calculating devices. They are or can be made into what Newell and Simon called a physical symbol system. A physical symbol system is something that has in it something, in this case zeros and ones in the computer, that can represent or be symbols for things in the world. So you can have a symbolic representation or a symbolic description in the language of the computer of the world. And then you can use rules to manipulate this symbol system, and therefore you can use computers to simulate important aspects of intelligence. And out of this was born what is sometimes called the information processing model of the mind. Newell and Simon called it the physical symbol system hypothesis. The hypothesis was that people and digital computers are two instances of a general species of machine called a physical symbol system, which generates intelligence by using logical rules to manipulate symbols. So the fact that you have bodies and brains and grow up in a culture and so forth turns out to be irrelevant on this hypothesis. It's a daring and amazing idea. But philosophers have thought things like this. I mean, Aristotle thought that, and Plato, that intelligence was different then and unrelated to the body, and if anything, the body just caused trouble and kind of blurred it. I mean, Descartes thought that too, and that culture was unrelated to intelligence and growing up in a culture was unrelated. It's just the natural outcome of our philosophical tradition, I think, or one branch of it, that somebody should come along and say, we're just physical symbol systems. A fancy way of saying it might be we're rational animals, or a less fancy. We're rational animals, and the animal part is one separate part, and the rational part is another part, and the rational part just does calculations. Thomas Hobbes, an important philosopher around 1600, said that when we reason, we do nothing but the addition of parcels. By the time you get to MIT, that just becomes calculation with bits, but it's the same idea. And things went very well. In the early 70s, they had gotten off to a flourishing start, and there'd been a whole lot of very successful artificial intelligence programs. First at Rand, where Newell and Simon were, and then at Carnegie Mellon, where Newell and Simon went, and then at MIT, where I was. And around 1970, there was the famous program you may have heard of called Shortlu. This is the one that gets written up all the time in the... It's a program by Terry Winograd that, I don't know, have anybody ever heard of it? It's in Science and Scientific American and so forth. It usually comes along as an example of the best of AI, and it is the best of AI. I think it's probably the best thing that was ever done. It simulates a blocks world, and you can ask the machine to do things with the blocks that it's showing you on its TV screen. You can say, put the red block on top of the green block. To do that, the computer has to understand the sentence you've typed in, and maybe let's suppose that there's a blue block on top of the red block. It has to figure out that it has to take off the blue block, pick up the red block, put it over on the green block. It has to find a place to put the blue block that it's taken off, and it can answer all sorts of questions, like, why did you move the blue block? And it'll say, to get at the red block. And why did you want to get at it, you can say. You don't even have to say the red block, just it. And it will figure that out, and it'll come back and say to put it on the green block. And you can say, and why did you want to do that? Again, that's very hard. You don't realize how hard it is. What's that? Well, the machine figures out what that is, and it says, because you told me to. So it is a very impressive program. And there were other impressive programs that solved simple analogy problems, like in IQ tests that about 10-year-olds could do, by a guy named Evans, a program by Waltz that did scene analysis, and they all got their PhDs, and they published their theses, and there were professional societies and journals and heroes of the field. And Minsky, who was one of the heroes of the field, said at this point, in 1967 this was, within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. And then, rather suddenly, just about the time I was starting to think about it, the field ran into unexpected difficulties. As far as I can tell, the trouble started when they tried to program computers to understand simple children's stories, the kind that a 4-year-old child could understand. One of the famous examples that I make a lot of in my book is a story. They wanted the computer to understand the story, meaning they wanted the computer to be able to answer the kind of questions about the story that a 4-year-old child could answer. So take this story. That story goes something like, Janet, and it was Jack's birthday. Janet and Jane were going to get him a present. "Let's get him a kite," said Janet. "No," said Jane, "he already has one. He'll make you take it back." Now, that sounds pretty simple to you, but you'll notice that in the story it doesn't say that the presents were for Jack, whose birthday it was. I may get the names wrong because I'm just making up names. It didn't say the presents were for Jack, whose birthday it was. It doesn't say that they were going to a party for him and to give him these presents, and you'd have to put that all into what would be called a birthday party frame. You'd have to tell the machine everything that normally happens in birthday parties. But you could probably do that, though whether you could do that for everything is a big question. But let's concentrate on another one. They wanted to be able to answer the question, which kite will he have to take back? And the answer is supposed to be, obviously, he'll make you take back the new kite. And unfortunately, I mean, in some other culture, maybe you could take back the old things when you got a new one, and that would be nice. But you have to know things about our culture, which wouldn't be in the birthday party story, the birthday party script. Things like if you've got two of them, then you do, and things like when people have two of the same thing, they don't want both of them, and therefore they have to get rid of one of them, and the way they get rid of one of them is, unfortunately, take the new one back. And now, the machine doesn't know that. And of course you could put that in, but that's just the tip of an iceberg. Let's go into it one bit further. They said, well, you'd have to give the machine something like a rule that if you've got one of something, you don't want another one just like it. But is that so? Is that true for dollar bills? Or for marbles or for cookies? Presumably not. It would have to be a rule like, for most things, everything else being equal, if you've got one of them, you don't want another one just like it. But what about everything else and being equal? How are you going to explain that to a computer? You've got to be a human being to understand that. It's very complicated. For instance, with cookies, if the cookie is a foot in diameter, one might be all you want. And then again, if you were a cookie monster, maybe one wouldn't be all you want. And so you could make up exceptions, and any normal kid will know exactly what the right answer would be about all that. But how you'd ever put that into a computer, no one knew. Everybody knew that what you needed was a theory of common sense. That is, you needed to explain to the computer what it was to be a human being. Because the computer comes into the world even more alien than a Martian. It hasn't the slightest idea what it's like to have a body and to have feelings and to be hungry and to grow up in a culture and to want one kite but maybe not two. I'm not even sure it applies to kites that you don't want two just alike. In any case, and whether you would be annoyed or disgruntled or amused or outraged or what if somebody gave you another kite, depending on a lot of other factors. The computer doesn't know any of that. It has to have a theory of moods, a theory of each mood. That means it has to know every occasion on which you would, say, feel jealous, and just how jealous you would feel, and whether you'd feel more jealous if you were tired or less jealous. And the idea of a theory of everything that we don't have to have a theory of, because we are it, but a theory of what we are, so that the computer could have a representation of what we are, that is, it could know it, that looked really appalling. And Minsky's mood changed completely in the course of 15 years. He told a reporter in 1980, the AI problem is one of the hardest science has ever undertaken. And somebody told me that in a lecture series where I spoke and he spoke earlier, he now said he thought we could do it in 300 years. That is not exponential progress. That is sort of exponential regress as far as I can see. That's what a degenerating research program looks like. Nothing new has been done to deal with this basic problem of common sense in the last 15 years since it surfaced around 1970. A year ago, there was a Scientific American article on AI by David Waltz, one of these people I mentioned. And it was more like nostalgia than it was like science. Every program he mentioned was over 10 years old. A very strange field. Why it was an article in the Scientific American at all is part of the strangeness of this whole field's attraction to the media. But when you read the article, you couldn't understand what was supposed to be going on in this field. Waltz told you the happy story of Shortlew for half the article, finished in about 1969, and then about his own program in 1970 and so forth. So I think they've made no more progress with this basic common sense problem than when it hit 15 years ago. And there are a lot of people in the field who I think agree with that now in various ways. In fact, they used to hate me, and I used to think they were frauds. Now things have become much more friendly. We both agree that the common sense knowledge problem is a very, very hard problem, and I think they'll never solve it, and they think they will. But I think they're honest enough to see that it's tough. They have to admit that it may be too tough. I think that it's not even a common sense knowledge problem. I mean, it's bad enough. It would be bad enough if we knew all this stuff about moods and kites and so forth, and all they had to do was get what we knew out of us and into the computer. But I don't think we even know it. We are it. I mean, we don't know a theory about moods so we can figure out whether on a certain occasion we ought to be jealous. We just get jealous. We don't know how far to stand from people when we carry on conversations in this culture. We're just trained up to do it that way by people who don't know what they're training us into. And it's not obvious that there are any rules for it. Or if they are, there are certainly things like everything else being equal. If there's no jackhammer in the background and they haven't got the flu, stand this close to people when you talk to them. So it looks bad for AI right now. And there are other problems, too. It's turned out that people use images when they think sometimes. You can give them a picture and another picture like you have on aptitude tests, and you can ask them whether this is the same as that one. And depending on how much one of them is rotated of degrees away from the one you're trying to match, it will take people a certain amount of time to find out whether they match. And lo and behold, it's been shown by a psychologist at Stanford that it takes an exactly constant amount of time. That is, the greater the rotation, the longer the time. It's strictly linear. People just rotate images at a certain speed. And you can't reproduce that with a computer because a computer wouldn't compare images, it would compare descriptions. Computers don't have images. And people tried for a while to figure out how you would, if our brain is a physical symbol system, how come it produces this peculiar illusion that we are rotating images at a constant speed, and nobody could figure out how you could possibly get that result if we were a physical symbol system. So that was a shock. And then something called prototypes came along, and that was a shock. Eleanor Roche, again at Berkeley, came up with this idea because she was a philosophy undergraduate before she became a psychology professor and had studied Wittgenstein, who says that we recognize objects not by having definitions of them, which then we can see whether, say if you could define a dog as it has 4 legs and barks and has a tail and wags it or something, and then you could look around to see if anything fit this definition. But maybe we recognize dogs by having seen a lot of typical dogs and recognizing the ones we see as more or less like the typical cases we have something like images of. And that's what Eleanor Roche thought, and she actually did experiments to show that we really do seem to have these prototypes. And again, this was a big shock for computers because they don't use particular examples, and they can't do things by similarity. Similarity has to be turned into having a certain number of identical features, whereas it looks like similarity for grown-up, or not grown-ups, for anybody, human beings, probably dogs too, is just some basic thing of being more or less like something else. How that could be possible in a brain is something I could talk about in the discussion period, if we want to. So there are all these problems for computers that are utterly unsolved. The similarity problem is sometimes called the analogy problem, and that's another problem that everybody realizes can't be solved. Even the AI handbook of 1981 says many key thought processes like recognizing faces and reasoning by analogy are puzzles. We don't have adequate computational mechanisms for them. So it looks like a certain philosophical idea that had been around since Descartes, that we have mental representations of the world. The representation in our mind is made out of a lot of primitive features, and these primitive features mirror the features of the world, and the relation between these features mirror the relation between features in the world, and we think by manipulating those representations. That idea may have reached its end in artificial intelligence. It still lives on in Sesame Street, I saw about 2 days ago, where some little kid has a picture of a house in his head and he gives out some words, and pretty soon the other little kid gets a picture of a similar house in his head. That's pure Descartes. It's now being taught as self-evident to 5-year-olds. But it may not be the way language and thinking work at all, and the reason, besides a lot of philosophical objections to it, the chips are down for it in AI, and the symbolic representation story isn't working. But now the funny thing is, just when this should become, you'd think then that everybody would just say, ho-hum for AI, it was a good try, alchemy didn't work either, and people trying to flap their wings and fly didn't work either, we better try it some other way. But in fact, AI had got a new lease on life about 3 years ago, because people began using the methods of AI to make something called expert systems. And these expert systems really did work. They worked because people had the bright idea that just as they had had success in these micro-worlds like Shurdlu, which didn't connect up with the rest of human life. Remember, Shurdlu was a world of ideal blocks. It didn't connect in any other way with people's feelings, bodies, or anything. And games are like that. Computers do fairly well at chess and checkers. Think about that. That's, again, a micro-world. In chess, only the color and position of the piece is relevant to the game. How much it weighs, whether it's dusty, whether it's hot or cold, whether it's in the center of the square or off the center of the square, whether it's a queen or a king and you have feelings about mothers and fathers and kings and queens, is irrelevant. And therefore, computers can do well in those domains. So people had the bright idea, particularly Edward Feigenbaum at Stanford, that you should never mind AI. Let's use computers in domains that don't connect up with the common sense world, images, prototypes, analogies. And so they made expert systems. I just to tell you about some of them. The descendant of Shurdlu and these things that are in micro-worlds are systems like Mycin and Prospector. And Dendron. These are the these are the famous expert systems that you read about and hear about a lot. If you read in Business Week, in New York Times, for instance, in Newsweek, headline, Japan and the United States are rushing to produce a new generation of machines that can very nearly think. And that's called the fifth generation. Those are supposed to be computers with expert systems and at least that kind of intelligence. And these programs, just to give you an idea, Mycin takes scores on blood tests, like how much red cells and white cells and sugar and more sophisticated things, and actually comes up, it has lots of rules in it for what different combinations of these features generally mean, and it comes up with a diagnosis of what kind of infectious blood disease, a narrow range of diseases that person has, and it's pretty good at that, and it comes up also with an estimate of how accurate its answer is, and it can also then be put with a drug thing, and it can actually prescribe drugs. And it has been shown to be better than a general practitioner at doing that sort of thing, but not as good as as the best blood disease specialists. And Prospector, Prospector is a program that was on the Dan Rather News in a quite dishonest way. I go around debunking these things, partly because I don't think anybody should be told things that aren't true, but partly to prepare you in the future. Just because you hear on some respectable television station or see on Nova or read in the New York Times that a computer has just done something that I say it can't do, there's no reason to believe at all that it's actually done it. This stuff is just utterly out of touch with reality. Prospector takes reports about the geological formations in a certain area, and using a lot of rules, again, gotten from geologists, it tells you what the likelihood that certain ore will be there. And in one case, to test it, it was given information from an area where they knew there was molybdenum, and lo and behold, on Mount Tolman, and lo and behold, it came out right with the claim that there was molybdenum. Everybody knew it was there, and everybody knew it was too deep to mine, but that wasn't the point. By the time it got to the Dan Rather News, people in Washington wanted molybdenum, so they typed into a computer what they wanted, and the computer said, go look at Mount Tolman in Washington, D.C. And you see a helicopter going to Mount Tolman, and they dug there, and they found molybdenum. By the time it got to I think it was the New York Times, it said that they found ore that was worth millions of dollars, which it probably was if they could have gotten it out, but it was down too deep and too impure. But nonetheless, it did find the molybdenum. I mean, I'm not saying that this is stupid. These expert systems really work. They just get exaggerated. And Dendral does analysis of spectrographs. It's interesting only because it was the first one, Feigenbaum's one. And it does it better than most chemists. So what have they got then in this fifth generation? What they've got is they've discovered that if you give computers a lot of facts that experts know, and what's called heuristic rules, which are the rules of good practice that experts acquire over years of work, as Feigenbaum puts it, then you can get these systems to perform very impressively. And why shouldn't this happen? Isn't that just what you'd expect? If you agree with Feigenbaum that, quote, almost all the thinking that professionals do is done by reasoning, then when you see that you don't use computers just for computation but for reasoning, then you'd expect them to perform as well as the experts. And this view isn't new. I mean, in fact, it ought to seem obvious to you that, aha, that's the way to do it. Because people have been thinking this way for about 2,000 years. It starts with Plato, in fact. Any of you read the Euthyphro in any Plato course? The Euthyphro, which is the very early dialogue by Plato about Socrates at the very beginning of our philosophical culture. You get Socrates going around asking people who are experts in various fields to give him the definitions and the rules, the principles that he would have said for their expertise. So he says to Euthyphro, who's a religious prophet, I want to know what is characteristic of piety, to use as a standard whereby to judge your actions and those of other men. That what he wants from Euthyphro is a piety-recognizing heuristic. After all, Euthyphro is an expert at piety recognition. Socrates could get out this heuristic, then anybody could do it. But there is a problem. Euthyphro keeps giving him examples of things that people have done and that gods and Zeus has done, which everybody considers pious. But Socrates keeps insisting that he doesn't want examples. He wants the rule that enables Euthyphro to pick out those examples as examples of piety. And Euthyphro simply cannot come up with any rules. And then finally Socrates gives up on him, as he does in all these dialogues. Socrates ran into the same problem, as you probably know, with craftsmen and poets, and horror for Socrates, even with statesmen. Even the statesmen didn't know any principles to explain their judgments. So Socrates could only conclude that they didn't know anything. And since none of them could give him any principles, and Socrates certainly didn't have any principles, so he concluded he didn't know anything either, and that was not a terribly good start for philosophy. But Plato came along and fixed it up. Plato said, here's the problem. Experts once knew the rules they use, but they've forgotten them. They still play a role in the expert's mind. They still help the expert do what he does. And the role of the philosopher is to help people remember the principles on which they act. So now knowledge engineers, which is the latest version of this, say the same thing. They want to get the rules the experts use, and they think the experts have put the rules in a different part of their mental computers. They have compiled the rules so that they work automatically. And now the problem for the knowledge engineer is just like the problem for the philosopher. It's to get the people to recollect these rules. Feigenbaum puts it very simply. He says, when we learned how to tie our shoes, we had to think very hard about the steps involved. Now that we've tied many shoes over our lifetime, that knowledge is compiled, to use the computing term for it. We can no longer get it into our consciousness. So you can't tell me the rule for tying your shoes. But the rule is still there, playing a causal role in helping you tie your shoes or making you tie your shoes when you turn it on. And how else could it work? After all, you had to follow the rule to tie your shoes once upon a time. You must still be following it now. And yet, every time experts are asked for their rules, from Socrates up to the present, they can't give the rules. As Feigenbaum puts it, the expert's knowledge is ill-specified and incomplete. The expert doesn't know what he knows about his domain. And the most interesting quote from Feigenbaum is, when you try to get the expert to give you the rules, you get what I would call a Euthyphro response. Feigenbaum says, the experts say, That's true, but if you see enough patients or rocks or chip designs, whatever their expertise is, you see that it isn't true after all. What the expert is saying, well, that's only a everything else being equal rule at best. And worse, Feigenbaum comments with really Socratic annoyance. He says, at this point, knowledge threatens to become 10,000 special cases. And that's exactly would be a disaster. Where are the principles? There are all kinds of other hints of trouble. I mean, I haven't told you, but I hinted at it. The Meissen system does as well as a general practitioner, but not as good as the expert blood disease specialists whose rules it's running with great speed and accuracy and whose facts it has all crammed in and never forgets. The same with Prospector, the same with Dendral. They never do as well. They do about 75% as well as the experts whose rules they've got. Now, all that is very strange. And the question is, how can that be? Another example, I can't skip over it, I can't resist, because again, it's this debunking thing. I'll try to say it briefly. Another example of this is checkers. Checkers was the first thing that people tried to program. In 1947, even before AI existed, Arthur Samuel at IBM decided he would get the rules out of checker players and write a checker playing program. And the interesting thing is that everybody who knows about this field believes that the checker program that Samuels wrote is as good as is a championship master checker program. And if it were, it would ruin my case, because, as you'll see in a minute, my case depends upon the claim that no expert system is ever as good as the rules of the experts that it's gotten out of, as the rule that's gotten out of the experts and is running. So what happened with Samuel's program is people say things like, Feigenbaum says, by 1961, Samuel's program played championship checkers and it learned and improved with each game. Even the AI handbook, which I quoted on analogy, which was honest on analogy, says, and I think it really believes it, today's programs play championship-level checkers. In my own book, I said that only one person in the world could beat the Samuel program, because in my book, I thought only common sense knowledge was the problem. I thought expert systems were possible. Well, it turns out then, just a few months ago, Samuels gave an interview at Stanford, where he turned 80 and was a retired professor, and he said that the program is capable of beating any amateur player and can give better players a good game. That's all. It's one of these 75%. It's not a world champion. He also said that he fears he may be reaching the point of diminishing returns, having called in experts and gotten out their rules for 35 years. And he says, in good Socratic fashion, the experts don't know enough about the rules they use in playing the game. So in every area, this is repeated. And so it looks to me like one ought to call into question the very idea of expertise that's in our philosophical tradition that makes us believe that these expert systems ought to work and makes us think that only a fool will keep giving you examples when he should be giving you the rule by which he recognizes those as examples. So, but I couldn't, that's all the further I could really get. In my book, I still believed expert systems were possible. And then my brother, who was a computer scientist but suspicious of computers and utterly untouched by the philosophical tradition, he's never read a philosophy book or I think even a novel in his life, came into this story, and he has a fresh view of this that anybody tainted by Socrates doesn't. He said, well, let's just see what it's like to have expertise. Let's not assume the story which everybody believes, namely that you get to be an expert in a domain by looking at a lot of examples, gradually abstracting and interiorizing more and more sophisticated rules, compiling those rules into the unconscious, and then being able to deal with lots of cases. Maybe it's not like that. So we actually did a study of expertise. We asked ourselves about how we learned to drive, and my brother, who's a very good chess player, asked himself how he learned to play chess, and finally we actually did psychological experiments on chess players, and we decided that there are 5 stages people go through in acquiring expertise, and that the story is exactly the upside down, the inverse, the contrary of the story that goes from Socrates to Plato to Samuels to Feigenbaum, etc. So I'm going to tell you these 5 stages very briefly because I want to give us plenty of time to discuss this. Okay, the first stage we call novice. The names are not important. What's important is what happens. What happens in the novice stage is exactly the thing that philosophers have been looking at all along, because it's the stage, I think, in which people are most reflective about their skills, and it's the stage in which people are always find themselves when there is a breakdown and their skills don't work. They're back to novice, so it's a very frequent place to be. And in a novice, learning a new skill, you're told context-free features which you can recognize without any experience in the domain, and you're given rules for how to deal with that domain. I'm going to give you examples constantly from driving and chess, because one, that's the way we figure it out, and two, lots of people do one or the other or both, and three, I want to make it clear that this is not just mental skills or physical skills, but any skill that you learn when you're a grown-up. It doesn't work for kids. I have no idea how kids learn to walk and talk. It's completely mysterious. They don't have teachers, and they don't get rules, and they don't learn the grammar and the features of their language. But never mind them. When you're grown up learning a second language, you do it this way. But take the car example. You learn things like, if you're driving a shift car, when the speedometer needle points at 20, shift from first to second. It's a rule that you don't need any knowledge of anything to do. It's a kind of rule a computer could follow. If you're a chess player, you learn things like a queen is worth 9, a rook is worth 5, and then the rule, if you can exchange to gain points, do it. So always, no matter what the situation, if you can change a queen for a rook, do it. Of course, that's not going to get you very far. The rules ignore context. The traffic rules don't take any account of... you learn things, too, like stay so many feet behind a car in front of you and so forth. And all of this is very simple-minded, but it does get you started. You can think of these, really, as training wheels. I mean, it isn't that you want to become very, very good at using these rules, any more than when you have training wheels, you want to become very, very good at riding a four-wheeled quadricycle thing. The point is, you've got to get started in a domain if you're ever going to become good at it. So you get started, and then you get experience, and then you go on to another stage. Advanced beginner. I don't have any better names for this stage. It isn't a stage that people have ever noticed, I guess. But it's a stage in which you get to recognize not just features, but what my brother and I call, I would write here if I had time in the room, features, and here something like aspects. Features of these context-free things, like the speedometer points at 20, or a queen is worth 9. An aspect is something you have to have experience to recognize. After you've been driving a while, you learn to shift a second when the motor sounds like it's straining. That's not something you can give features for. You get to recognize typical straining motors on hills with loaded cars and unloaded cars and in rainy weather and not. And when the motor sounds like it's straining, when it's enough like one of those typical motor straining cases, you shift. And you also sometimes fail, and then you have to learn some more cases. And in chess, you learn to recognize things like unbalanced pawn structure and weakness on the king's side, and rules for avoiding unbalanced pawn structures and exploiting weakness on the king's side. Things that you have to be a sophisticated chess player even to see. I don't see that when I look at a chessboard, but I certainly do know when a motor's straining because I know how to drive a car. Then, after you've stayed in that stage for a while, you can go into another stage. We call it competence. In competence, you discover that you can't keep track of all the rules and all the aspects. If you know these beginning drivers, you can't even talk to them. Their whole mental machinery is occupied in trying to just be able to tell when they should shift a second and how far they should be behind the car in front. That won't do. And so they learn to simplify things by paying attention only to the important rules and features at any given moment. In driving, for instance, to switch the example a little, you might make a distinction between deciding to get someplace in a hurry, in which case you pay attention to the shortest route and whether there are any police in the rearview mirror, and you don't care about the comfort of the passengers or the scenicness of the route. Or you might decide you have a pleasant time to drive, and then you care about the comfort and you care about the route and you relax and so forth. You choose a plan and you only pay attention to certain things. In chess, you decide you're going to attack the king's side so you can let certain pawns be lost over here on the queen's side. You don't care, and if your attack is successful, you won't need them. Now, what's interesting about this is something very important comes in here. which is involvement. In the first two stages, you're like a computer, at least in the sense that you're not involved. Even in the third stage, your involvement doesn't play any role in what you're doing, but you can't help being emotionally concerned. In these stages, you just apply the rules to the features. Here, you just apply the rules to the aspects. Here, you come to a decision about what you think the basic goal is, and then you just apply again these things. But here, when you come to a decision about your goal, it's involving, because it's up to you to decide what your goal is, and what happens to you makes a big impression. If you're rushing to catch a plane and you get a ticket and you miss the plane, that makes a big impression. But if you don't get a ticket and barely just manage to catch the plane, then you're very elated. And in chess, too, I mean, if you decide to attack the king side and you win, and if you believe, like Bobby Fischer, that chess is life, you feel that you've made a huge victory. And if, on the other hand, you don't make the attack, but you've lost so many pieces that you thought were irrelevant, that then you lose, and my brother says you feel it in the pit of your stomach. As a member of the chess team, I'm sure that's how he knows. And what happens is that all these emotional memories of whole situations, gestalted in terms of what is relevant and irrelevant because of your decision about what's important, and further organized in terms of opportunities, threats, risks, victories, and defeats, all that is going into your mind somewhere, we think, being stored up, so that if you let yourself not be rational, and some people get stuck in chess, for instance, at the level of being rational, and they are never good chess players. But if you let yourself not be rational, and in driving, you haven't got time to be rational, you get to the next level, which we call proficiency. When you're proficient, you don't have to figure out what the issue is. You just are involved in what you're doing, and what the issue is just is obvious to you. So in driving, to take a different example now, you're going off an expressway onto the off-ramp. If you were only at the competent level, you'd have to say, let me see, I'm in a hurry, the thing is banked at 10 degrees, and it's rainy, and I'm going 40 miles an hour, that's too fast, figure, I better slow down to 20. By that time, you'd be dead, of course, so you don't drive on freeways and off-ramps while you're only competent. But by the time you're proficient, you don't have to figure it out. When you're on the off-ramp, you just feel if you're going too fast. And that's the same in chess. In chess, a good chess master can tell you in about 10 seconds what the issue is, whether he should attack or defend, and what he should attack or defend. He doesn't figure it out. It just looks that way to him when he looks at the board. Then, of course, if you're only only proficient, you still have to figure out what to do. So you're on the off-ramp, you know you're going too fast, but you have to figure out whether to let your foot off the gas or just let it up on the gas or jam on the brake, and that again is dangerous to have to figure that out. But you're on the way, a little more experience, or maybe a lot more experience, and you finally get to be an expert. And what happens with an expert? Well, it happens to you all the time. When you're driving along and you suddenly feel you're going too fast, your foot just goes up on the gas or takes off from the gas or goes onto the brake. You could be carrying on a conversation about philosophy and not even notice that you thought you were going too fast and that your foot took care of it. It all happens because, at least this is what my brother and I think, and at least it looks this way, it all happens because you've stored enough cases now that this case is similar to some case that you've been in which you've already successfully dealt with this, and you've stored that memory, and you just deal with it in the same way. In chess, it turns out to look the same. You can deal with a chess grandmaster can see in a few seconds what the right move is. It just pops into his head. What chess grandmasters are doing when they're doing all this thinking in tournaments is checking it out to see that it hasn't got any hidden flaws, or even better, if you're Bobby Fischer, trying to think of a move that wouldn't pop into anybody's head, because the move that you're about to make would pop into the other grandmaster's head too, as the right move to make in this situation. If you can make another move than the right move to make, which is still all right, then you will really win. But the the right thing to do is just obvious. And people have calculated, Herb Simon of all people, the guy on the other side, knows that chess players do this, and he thinks that they must have stored at least 50,000 chess positions in order to do this, because it doesn't look like they're figuring out what to do. It looks like they can recognize this as like something. We did an experiment with a chess master. He was a junior international chess master when he was young, and then he went to graduate school instead in computer science. So we've got him around Berkeley to torture with our experiments, and he's still a world-class chess master. So to test our theory, we did the following thing on him. Our theory is experts, all of us, in all those domains where we're experts, don't solve problems, don't figure anything out, don't apply any rules. Experts simply do what normally works from their past experience, and by definition it normally works. And that's all there is to it. The whole problem-solving view of expertise is a big mistake. So how would you test it? Well, you would try to jam somebody's problem-solving ability and see if they could still play chess, for instance. So we got Julio Kaplan to count up beeps. We had a computer, because you use them in experiments in psychology, and we love computers. I have two, and my brother has one, and we play with them all the time. We got a computer, and we were having it give out beeps, and it was going beep, or beep, beep, or beep, beep, beep at random, and he had to add these beeps up serially as fast as he could. So he would be saying 3, 5, 7, 8, and then we got him to do that as fast as he could. And that was supposed to occupy his problem-solving mind. And we even checked that it occupied his problem-solving mind by giving him chess problems to solve while he was doing that, and wouldn't let him slow down counting. And he about went crazy, and he couldn't solve the chess problems because his mind was too busy counting the beeps. Then we set him to play chess at 5 seconds a move with another master chess player. There are plenty around the Bay Area. They can live anywhere in the world, so they live where it's warm. And what happened was amazing. It turned out that Julio could keep counting the beeps without slowing down and just making moves, like saying 13, 17, and then making moves. And the other master had some time to think at 5 seconds a move. He could think in the spaces when the other guy was moving. Julio won 3, tied 1, and lost 1, and played master-level chess without having any time to think at all. He was just recognizing positions and doing what felt right. And that seemed to me so incredible. Then I asked Stuart how this was possible, my brother, and he said, well, think of it this way, that you could recognize the faces of all your friends as I presented them at the door while you were doing this adding task. You don't have to solve any problems or think to recognize your friends. To a chess player, chess positions are as familiar as faces, and the move attached to them is like as familiar as a name. Only a chess grandmaster isn't like you or me. He's like a world-class politician who, say, knows 20,000 people and their names and their wife's names and so forth. And he could go on doing that while counting this task. So you just got to realize that it's not as mystical as it seems. It just takes an immense amount of involved experience with talent for that domain, talent being the ability to remember the relevant images, and you can do it. So the moral of it is that it seems that a beginner makes inferences and uses rules just like a computer, but that with a great deal of experience, the beginner develops into an expert who intuitively sees what to do without applying any rules. Now, you can't prove that this is the case just by introspection. It may still be that unconsciously, deep down in a way we can't get at, he's got a lot of very sophisticated rules. But at least once you give the right description, which nobody's ever given in the history of philosophy, it seems to me, and this is the right description, I'm sure, then the burden of proof is on anybody who thinks that experts are following unconscious rules to give any evidence of this. And the fact that these systems who follow rules don't do very well seems more evidence against the rule story. See, the point, and now we can understand why, when Socrates or Feigenbaum ask the experts for their rules, the experts can't give them rules, but only examples. The expert simply isn't using any rules. He's doing just what Feigenbaum feared he might be doing, recognizing tens of thousands of special cases. And then you can see why expert systems are never going to be as good as experts. If one asks the experts for the rules they use, then you force the expert to regress to the level of a beginner, what he remembers from graduate school or wherever he learned this thing, and he gives you the rules he remembers but no longer uses. If you then program those rules into a computer, you can use its speed and its accuracy and its ability to store millions of facts to do better than a beginner. An expert system is something like an expert novice. It's a kind of super beginner, but no matter what you do, you can't get a computer to capture the knowledge that an expert has when he stored his experience of tens of thousands of actual cases. So now you're in the proper position to be skeptical. When Feigenbaum says in his book, for instance, that we're in a position to gather up, to have in the fifth generation computers machine intelligence faster, deeper, and better than human intelligence, you should recognize that as a late stage of Socratic thinking with no rational and no empirical basis. And if people come along and tell you we should begin a crash program to compete with the Japanese to make these fifth-generation computers, then you can believe, I think, that they're blinded by Socratic assumptions and personal ambition. Whereas my hero, anyway, is Euthyphro, the expert on piety, who kept giving Socrates examples instead of rules. He was the true prophet after all. Okay. Whatever everybody wants to do. I talked an hour, right? Okay, I'm ready for questions. Okay, go ahead.
I agree with you that computers are never going to imitate human intelligence, but can it be that computers are going to evolve their own kind of intelligence? Several people recently have been arguing that computers are life forms with the human race serving as part of their reproductive system. I tend to agree with that. I think computers are alive. Do you agree?
No, I don't. But it's hard. That's the toughest question. I have clear answers to most questions that people ask. I have a kind of intuition that this notion of an alien intelligence may not even make any sense. I mean, here's my feeling about it. I mean, what would it be like to have an intelligence which wasn't like our intelligence? I mean, we recognize that people have desires and needs and are trying to do certain things, and we recognize clever solutions to the sort of problems that people have. And we recognize people are learning from their experience and so forth. Now, here's something which we say, well, it doesn't have any problems like our problems, and it doesn't have any solutions like our solutions, and it doesn't learn anything in our sense of learn anything. It's a different kind of intelligence. But I'm not sure I know what intelligence means when people say that. I have a feeling that that's just a kind of empty talk. But I'm open to consider it. I mean, it doesn't fit. You see, the people are trying to program computers to be intelligent like us. Certainly, the way to get them to be intelligent, have some other kind of intelligence, is not to get them to fail to be intelligent like us. That's certainly not a sufficient condition for being anything but stupid. But how would you go about programming a computer to have an alien intelligence? I don't know. Yeah.
With computers getting smaller and smaller, faster and faster, could it be possible that we'll get to a point where, talking about your expert novice going through all the rules and going through all the possibilities and permutations and everything, could it be possible that we could get to a point of intelligence that's going to be good enough, that will give us the right answers, even though it may not be exactly what humans do?
Okay. Well,
good enough.
I think there's sort of two stages of answering that. My answer and my brother's answer, which is a lot better than my answer. My answer would have just been something like, it's just going to be too complicated to know all the rules and all the qualifications and all the ways that everything else could be equal and not be equal. But that's not an interesting answer, because then they can say, yeah, but the computers are going to be very, very fast and make millions of inferences per second. How do we know whether they won't finally get enough? So I think the interesting answer is something, again, no philosopher probably would have ever thought of, because it's, again, to question something so fundamental in our tradition that I've never heard it questioned before, but once you hear it, I think you can see that it's not obvious that we should, it makes sense. I mean, maybe there just aren't any principles underlying a lot of areas in which we behave intelligently. I mean, the whole point you're making is the principles may be very many, and they may be very, it may take a long time, and you may need a very fast machine. But think about chess. It's not at all obvious that there are any principles at all that explain why a certain move is the right move at a certain stage of the game. It may just be that, having played a lot of games, the chess tradition has now got it pretty clear that the best move to make at this point is this, because all the other moves get you in trouble and this one doesn't. It isn't at all obvious that there needs to be sort of a set of rules like, control the center, control the tempo, develop your pieces, that those would ever lead you to know that that was the right move. And indeed, my brother tells me that when the Russians comment on chess games on the radio, they don't say Botvinnik did this or Karpov did that because of these and these and these principles. They say things like, if he does that, then the opponent will do this, and then he'll have to do that, and then look where he'll be, reducing it to an obvious known position, which everybody knows is, quote, ugly. So I'll give you another example. That's my brother's example. The example that more convinces me is the following. Part of common sense knowledge that people have not been able to deal with, the easy part of common sense knowledge, is what is called common sense physics. I mean, never mind about jealousy and how far to stand from people and whether you would want this or that. Just take the kind of knowledge you have about what breaks when you drop it, what bounces when you drop it, what sticks to what scrapes what sloshes out of what, how to pour hot things and cold things and syrup and honey and so on and so forth. All the stuff you know about how the physical world behaves. Now, artificial intelligence is committed to the view that since we're all experts in dealing with the physical world, we must have a theory of common sense physics. There must be principles about how all this happens. And you get the impression that there must be principles about how it all happens because there's, after all, a theory of celestial physics. I mean, there really are principles explaining how the planets go around and what the comets do. But it isn't at all obvious that how all sorts of liquids behave and what scratches and sticks to what and what breaks and pushes what has any principles underlying it at all. And if you look at what kids do, they play for 3 or 4 years with wood and sand and water for hours and hours and hours in a way that is totally incomprehensible. I mean, particularly to me, it's always the way their time in sandboxes, endlessly playing with the sand. I think sand is interesting because it's something which behaves like a liquid until you get it wet, and then it behaves like a solid, which is very odd. But it gives you chances to discover how liquids behave and solids behave, and so you can play with it endlessly. But anyway, I think kids are storing up lots and lots of typical cases of scratchy things and pushy things and pory things and splashy things, and that when they get enough typical cases, they will be like you and me, able most of the time to act intuitively with everyday objects. Now, that's really the test. Is there such a thing as common sense physics, which has so many rules, and is the only issue between us whether computers will ever be fast enough and whether we'll ever be clever enough to get the principles of common sense physics so we can get them into the computer? Or are there domains in which there is no simpler representation than a whole lot of typical cases in those domains because there are no principles? It's a very important question. I have no idea how one would settle it. Nothing about verticals, horizontals, intersections plays any role in this story. What's happening is 2 wave fronts are interfering, and there are peaks of resonant energy, and those peaks of resonant energy are the energy is strongest where the similarity is greatest. And so now, you can use a computer, mathematical techniques called convolutions and correlations. This is in my brother's field, not mine. But you can do it. You can use a computer to make the equivalent of a hologram representation, say, of the chess game. You won't know how to do that yet. Nobody has the slightest idea. But at least using a computer that way, instead of like a description, you can have the equivalent of images, photographic images. You can have the equivalent of similarity recognition without breaking down the similarity into features. Similarity without similarity with respect to what? Just overall similarity. So that's the direction that my brother and I think people should go. And people are beginning to try this. There's a whole school of young people trying two different kinds of distributed representation. One is holographic, one is to make simplified models of the brain, idealize neurons, and then idealize connections with weights on them between those neurons, and then putting a pattern on and letting that reach equilibrium and training this neuron net. And you can do that too, simulating it on a digital computer. And both of these are called new connectionists. So you should keep your eye open. Every once in a while, some Byte magazine had something about this. I mean, these new connectionists, Hinton at Carnegie Mellon, Rummelhard at San Diego, two of the most well-known ones, and a whole bunch of their students are using it. And it works. I mean, you can actually use the holographic simulation. If there's a program in Finland that you can show 5 different pictures from different angles of 10 different faces. So now it's got 50 faces all stored in the same hologram. And then you can give it one of those 10 faces from a somewhat different angle, and it will give you the correlation of that to all of the particular ones it's got stored. And it'll get the face right. I mean, it will tell you that the pattern of spots, like on a television screen, the pattern of zeros and ones of the face that it's been trained. It's got these 5 faces connected with names. Yeah, and it will recognize which face it is, without again analyzing the face into features, and it only has to be similar. So anyway. I've never said, luckily, because if I had, I would be making a fool of myself. Well, I almost said once upon a time, but I haven't said lately, that the digital computers could never be intelligent. At the very beginning, the first edition of my book, I thought that since computers have zeros and ones, which are discrete little features, and since these zeros and ones are combined by logic gates, ands, ors, and so forth, that computers had to be used as logic machines, that there was something that made them necessarily able to instantiate only symbolic descriptions. And then I said, I thought they could never be intelligent. Now I have to be more careful. That is, I want to say computers, the degenerating research program is the physical symbol system program. It's using digital computers to recognize features and manipulate those features with heuristic rules that I think is not working. There's nothing in anything I've said that says that a digital computer programmed to simulate the brain, say, couldn't be intelligent. In fact, I think it sort of follows tautologically that if it's enough like the brain, it will surely be intelligent. That's a difficult question. I mean, what about the body? What about moods? But maybe moods are just more patterns of neurons. What else could they be? I mean, this is a sort of debate I'm carrying on with myself. I mean, nobody knows yet what you could do with computers if you didn't use them as physical symbol systems, because this is so new. Yeah.
Jeff Hinton certainly calls himself an AI person, and he does this. Why don't you call yourself an AI person?
Okay. Well, I mean, that's really just a question of definition. I gather you could say that this is all AI, and that what the degenerating research program is this Newell-Simon physical symbol system research program. But it's been identified with AI up to very recently, and the guy who named AI, John McCarthy, still believes in this physical symbol system story and so forth, that it's hard to say, but it's, again, we agree, just a question of words. I could say, I believe in AI, I just believe that a certain branch of AI, which has been the traditional branch, isn't going to work. I'd be happy to say that. These new connectionists do say they're doing AI, and you can see why. I mean, it's going to be artificial intelligence if they make it. So I could say that. I could say I'm not against artificial intelligence. I'm against using logic machines, or what's sometimes called inference engines, which is just another name for it, to make intelligence. Yeah.
It seems to me that your view of intelligence has certain implications for the educational process, mainly that expert teachers can't really help novice learners, and that we ought to simply turn people loose to gather and store data for themselves. It's
Well,
very akin to the PhD that you're learning and being an active learner.
No, you're absolutely right. Although I think it has big implications for education, but they don't have to be what you said. I mean, it certainly does say that experts would not be particularly good teachers if they had to give people rules to begin with. The way experts have to teach is by apprenticeship, and that's generally agreed. I mean, it's pretty well known that usually the really good physicists, for instance, and organic chemists aren't very good in the introductory courses, but they're very good for having graduate students around who learn to do things the way they do them. But there could still be something called expert teachers who are able to formulate these kind of training wheels, the most appropriate features and rules to get people started, even though they're not the features and rules that experts use. Somebody's got to do that. And there can be coaches, which would be the next level, who help people notice these perspicuous paradigm aspects, who say, look, this is the way the motor sounds when you should shift. Don't keep looking at the speedometer. And this coach would get people to build up their store of typical situations and know what to do. And that would be good. And the next thing is something very important, but I don't know quite what it is. I mean, one of the important things a teacher should do is not keep people at the rule level when they have gotten enough experience to have gone beyond it. When I was in school, I don't think in college maybe, but in grade school or something, if I got the right answer and I couldn't explain to the teacher the rule by which I got the right answer, the teacher would say, you don't know it. And that could be true if if I'm just beginning, say, long division, and I just wildly guess the right answer and I can't explain how I got it. But if I've been doing something for months and now I get the right answer and I can't explain how I'm doing it and I consistently get the right answer, then it's a mistake for the teacher to say, you don't really know what you're doing. That's just, it would be a Socratic thing to do. You don't know what you're doing until you can tell me the principles by which you did it. No, the teacher ought to encourage that and say, wow, you're finally getting really good. You don't know how you do it anymore, and I don't know how you do it anymore. Now, keep it up. Yeah.
I know that computers can be made to play themselves in the game of chess. And if you let that continue over game after game, will the computer gain experience to that? And if it does the computer use its computer experience as a human use its human experience?
Well, it's interesting. It's never been tried in chess. The chess story, let me just say while I'm at it, is an interesting story and supports my line. They tried to make chess programs for years using rules from chess masters, and they got nowhere. They didn't play they didn't play well at all. Now they use a very fast computer, a Cray computer, to calculate something like 5 million moves to look ahead 3 or 4 ply of all the moves. They don't try to use any principles at all. And by using what's called brute force, they've now gotten to play at almost master level without any heuristic rules and just the simplest what's called evaluation of the final position. So that's interesting. And they could conceivably someday get chess machines that will actually beat chess masters just by simple brute force calculation, though they've reached the limits for the fastest machines they've got now, and they can't beat the masters. But checkers is your case. What happened with Samuels was, when he couldn't get the rules out of the masters that would make his checker program play very well, he invented the first learning program. The checker program played with itself, and it changed its evaluation rules. That is, it said, let's put more weight on center control and less weight on developing all the pieces. Or let's try really crazy things. Let's sort of I think one of them was divide the board up this way and try to see if you keep an equal amount of pieces in each of these quadrants, whether you'll do better than if you get them all in one or another. And he made up all sorts of weird rules, and he let the machine play trying those rules and assigning different weights to them. And what happened was it turned out that the good old rules that people know when they are beginning to learn chess turned out to be the ones that were the best to follow. And it turned out that no matter how it varied its weights on these things, it couldn't play better than middle-level checkers. So, and though it's learned and played hundreds of thousands, well, maybe tens of thousands of games with itself, it didn't help. And you can see, again, it fits my story. If there aren't any rules for playing checkers, but just lots of experience with typical situations and what to do in them, then no matter how you refine your rules and the weights on your features, you're not going to play very good checkers. Yeah?
Your skepticism about the future of AI is clarified.
Let's call it traditional AI. Okay.
I find that interesting in comparison to some people in the philosophical community in their skepticism about AI. There's not so much skepticism in the sense that they think it's not very probable it will be fruitful, but there are some people, in fact, are militantly, that there is absolutely no chance that computers will ever model human mind or reproduce social behavior. I'm thinking of Lucas and some of these other.
John Searle, do you know John Searle's argument? Okay.
I think of these people, they use builds and complete theorem and things like this. And I'd like you to comment on.
Okay. Well, they're two quite different stories. Both of them have this in common, that they want to say that there is some knockdown argument that even if computers behaved in some areas just like we do, and we couldn't tell the difference, if they passed what's called the Turing test, which is the idea that you have a computer in a booth and a man in a booth and you don't know which is which, and you ask them any questions you want through teletypes and you can't tell which is which, even if the computer passed the Turing test, behaved like we do, it still wouldn't be the least bit intelligent. And one of these arguments, which didn't ever work, the Lucas argument. People tried to make the argument that there would be, and I won't try to explain this in detail, but using a Gödel proof for mathematics, that in a formal system, there will always be at least one formula which is true within the system but can't be proved in the system. They wanted to say, well, if human beings were formal devices, there would have to be something that, well, how is it? No, the other way around. But human beings could always see intuitively that this formula was true in the system, even if they couldn't prove it, and therefore they wouldn't be formal systems. But that got into all sorts of trouble, and it finally was given up, because nobody could tell when we would ever have such a formula, and maybe there is such a formula, but maybe it's somewhere out at the edge of our experience or the universe, and we'll never come across it, so forth. The Lucas thing didn't work. The latest thing is John Searle's argument, a colleague of mine at Berkeley. I think Searle's argument is very impressive. In fact, I think it's right, but I don't think it matters. But by this I mean, what Searle proves is that even if you could program a computer to behave exactly like us, it wouldn't be intelligent. The AI people should say, but who cares? If it behaves exactly like us, it'll be a triumph for AI, traditional or non-traditional. It'll change our culture, it'll change our understanding, and so forth. They didn't. They got very upset at Searle's argument for reasons I don't understand. I'll give you the argument. It's quite neat and funny. Searle says the way to find out whether a computer would be intelligent is to imagine yourself to be the computer. So you imagine yourself in a room, and people are giving you squiggles through the window, and you have a rule book in English, and you look up these squiggles, and they're correlated with other squiggles, and you give out the squiggles that the rule book says to give out. Now, unknown to you, these squiggles are Chinese, and this is a very complicated AI program that enables a computer to speak natural language Chinese. So what this room does is speak Chinese. You give in Chinese sentences in, it gives out appropriate Chinese sentences. And you're the computer now, and you have the program. Do you understand Chinese? If you're the guy in the room manipulating these squiggles? Certainly not. There is no understanding of Chinese in there, Searle says. The moral is supposed to be, even if a computer has all the rules for carrying on what seems to be a conversation with you in Chinese. There's no understanding of Chinese in that computer. Now that drives everybody crazy. Nobody knows what to make of this. I mean, is this a good argument or isn't it? It's been fought in the New York Review of Books. It's discussed in Hofstadter's The Mind's Eye, in Searle's new book, Minds, Brains, and Science, and so forth. But to me it shows something sad about philosophy, though this is a generalization that may not be justified, and sort of hope it isn't. But it looks to me like you can make really clear proofs in philosophy about things that aren't really relevant to anybody, like that. But that when it comes to things that are relevant to anybody, you end up usually with plausibility arguments. I mean, I don't have any nice, clear proof like that computers, which are physical symbol systems, can never be intelligent. I mean, you can always say they've got facts and rules at a level of we have facts and rules at a level of unconsciousness, and you can, if you got those facts and rules in a big enough computer, it would be intelligent. And I can just say, well, I certainly think it's unlikely. I've got plausible reasons against it. You've got no good reasons to believe it except Socrates and a tradition which has maybe been on the wrong track, and so forth. So it may be that when you try to do applied philosophy, you have to be willing in philosophy not to have knockdown, drag-out arguments. And it may be that when you get something so idealized and so refined that you can give an absolutely finished argument about it, it's no longer anything anybody really has to care about. That wouldn't make me give up philosophy. It would just make me do what I call applied philosophy and still admire Searle's argument, which I think is really very ingenious and impressive. But you see, it wouldn't make any difference to anything in our culture, I don't think. Whether when you get androids going around like in Blade Runner, or whether they are really intelligent, whether they are only absolutely like intelligent. I mean, what difference will it make? Yeah.
You were talking about your method of how someone goes from a beginner to an expert as the method an adult applies. You said that you now believe applies to children. So in a sense, what the people working in this field have done is expect the computer to become an adult without a childhood. Isn't it possible that if they try to give it a computer equivalent of a childhood, that it could also learn as a child, most likely learns that you can go through these steps. You start out as an novice, become an advanced beginner, etc., until the computer could learn.
Well, the trouble is, with that suggestion, one doesn't know what it would be like to give it a way of learning like a child. I mean, this is the way adults learn, the thing on the other side of the board, with rules and features, and that's how a computer starts. And that's why it looks promising. They start where we start. Why don't they learn what we learn? And but children my hunch is that children go directly from starting to acquire examples without ever passing through the rule stage. I mean, it looks like, it's funny, children in learning a language start getting it right, and then they reach a stage where it looks like they start making rules, and they get it all wrong. They say, they put ED on the end of everything and so forth. And then gradually they obviously learn all the special cases where that rule doesn't work, and they start getting it right again. There's a whole idea that perhaps enlightened Buddhist sages and children don't have to pass through the rule stage, but can simply accumulate examples. There's one guy who believes this, who's very intelligent, interesting, and that is Tim Gallwey, who wrote Inner Tennis. You may know that. And he's writing an education book now. It ought to be out pretty soon, in which his idea, by the way, he has much more extreme ideas that follow from something more extreme than my view. He thinks that it's never a good idea to think, because your body and your intuition and your experience always provides you better answers than you can figure out. But that people under pressure, when they get ego involved and so forth, and face problems, always revert to thinking, and then they play badly, say, in tennis. So if you could get somebody to learn to play tennis, for instance, without ever having passed through the rule stage, so that they couldn't revert to asking themselves, am I serving right, then they would play better tennis. So he has ways of teaching tennis so that he never tells you any rules at all. You just go out and hit things. And he wants to have a whole education system where you never even pass through this training wheels rules stage. But he's got ideas about how you would do it, even in arithmetic. You would just learn to recognize patterns from the start. And if you could do that, I think that'd be very interesting and maybe very valuable. I just have one big objection to this Galway move, which is sort of the mirror image of the traditional move. The traditional move is we always should be rational animals and learn how to solve problems, and logic courses teach us how to think logically, and whenever you are doing anything you ought to think logically. That's one wrong extreme. The other extreme is we should always be like Zen Buddhist masters and kids, and just intuitively know what to do when we're involved in ongoing expert behavior. That's another bad move, it seems to me, because there are problems. I mean, there are breakdowns in which none of your past experience and intuition tells you what to do. I mean, you face a phone in Italy or something, and it's all just different than anything you've ever seen, and that you've got to figure out what to do. And you better have learned, among other things, how to solve problems, how to figure out, how to pay attention to details and draw conclusions, so you can fall back on that. I don't know how much of a person's day is spent acting intuitively and how much is spent sort of solving problems, but I think probably, 80% of what we do, we don't have to solve any problems, and we don't have to think logically. But the times when we do can be very important life and death sort of times, and we ought to be able to do it. Yeah.
I think the thrust of your argument, if I may oversimplify, is that machines and computers cannot become like us. But I wonder if we can worry about the nature of being us. Is it immutable, or can we move around enough that computers and machines can become something else?
That's a good question. Yes. My worry is that we might become like them. I talk about that a little in my book. It seems to me that it would be great if AI worked, because it would be nice to have these flexible computers that would understand everyday language and continuous speech and read our writing and so forth. Then I think that'd be just great. I don't see anything to worry about there. But what one has to worry about is we get more and more dependent on computers because they are so valuable to us, and they can't understand continuous speech. They can't tell ice cream in ice cream cone from ice cream when I need help, because it isn't any different. I mean, the sound stream of those two is exactly the same. The space you hear between ice cream and when I order ice cream and ice cream when I scream for help is not there in the sound stream. So computers can't understand continuous speech, and they can't understand continuous script. So we are going to maybe have to, can you imagine everybody in school having to learn to write the kind of machine-readable script that your bank check has at the bottom? Why shouldn't you write the amount in that? Some human being now has to sit there all day transcribing the numbers you write on checks into the computer. If you would just learn to write exactly in the right squares, exactly the right way, then nobody would have to do it. And I can imagine these kids being sort of punished, or your bank account gets closed on you if you can't learn to write these numbers right. And you've got to learn probably to talk to these computers just like this, because computers can perfectly well understand speech if there are spaces. It just can't understand continuous speech. So there are all these sort of problems. I don't know how devastating it would be to our culture. It might just be another thing people have to learn to do. But it's sort of scary that people would have to learn to, in all their interactions with computers, to be very rigid, very precise, formal, be sure you don't use any background human understanding. For instance, if there was a computer travel agent, I read this someplace, they were trying to make a computer travel agent. It sounds at least a computer airline schedule. That doesn't sound too bad. You ought to be able to call it up or type to it, let's say, because it can't understand continuous speech, that you want to go from Indianapolis to New York, and you want to leave around 8 o'clock. And then it says, we have a flight at 8:15. And then you say, no, I'd like something a little earlier. And it calculates a while and comes back and says, aha, I got a flight at 8:14. Now, that's a little earlier, all right, but it's obviously not got the human sense of time. And you'd have to learn to talk to this kind of computer thing, being very careful not to use this background understanding that we all share, that a minute like that isn't going to make any difference. So yeah, that's all bothersome. I mean, I guess I see a future in which it's just going to be something you learn in school, how to talk to computers, and it's going to be a very inhuman thing you have to learn to do. How bad it is, I just don't know. It's not fun, I'm sure of that. Should we stop? I think we should. Okay.